I was at the bottom of this dank, slimy, cold hole in the ground, and his was the one warm, dry hand when I, finally reached up that helped me out of it. He said, "You need to come with me." I said, "To where?" He said, "To Kansas." And now I'm trying to wriggle out of it. At this point, I said, "You need 2 kayaks and a float plane to get to Toronto from here. Are we going to get to Kansas?" At which point, Jack piped up behind, said, "Yeah, I've got a G5.
He was a drug addict alcoholic who could play golf on an international level with the best of them. David Feherty left that game that made him famous to become one of the most talked about and beloved golf commentators in the business. He's also the host of his own interview show on the Golf Channel, a show that's more about his guests than the game the channel is named for. And it was on the set of his show in Orlando, Florida, where we caught up with him.
David, you grew up in Northern Ireland. I was curious as to whether or not your family or yourself at that point growing up there were all politicized by the climate in Northern Ireland.
Well, it was impossible not to be affected by it, but we're a very small family. We lived in 2 Hazeldean Avenue, and my father's brother, my Uncle Jack, lived in 22 Hazeldean Avenue, so there's some mix-up with the mail as well. We were in an area where there was very little violence, but you couldn't help but be surrounded by it. Right. There were bombs, there were sectarian murders, there was an enemy that hid behind women and children that wouldn't wear a uniform. It was a strange atmosphere looking back, to grow up in, although I don't think it affected me very much.
You mentioned, we were just chatting before we started filming here, but you were talking about growing up with classical music, but you also sang, did you not?
I did. Yeah.
You were trained?
Yes. I sang from about 5 or 6 in the church choir, and did that twice every Sunday and on Wednesday nights. One of the reasons I don't go to church, other than the fact that I don't like to be surrounded by sinners, is that I'm probably still in credit, I think, with all of that stuff. But it was a huge part of my life, singing, growing up. And when my voice broke, I had a beautiful voice as a child, as a treble, but it's always, I was in between a baritone and a tenor. I was a baritone in tight underwear, and I decided, I'm not sure I was particularly good at either, but I chose golf over, and I was studying, opera music at the time, and I thought, the last thing the world needs is another mediocre Irish tenor clutching the bar, butchering Danny Boy.
And the golf came, your father golfed. Is that where you got turned on to golf?
Yeah, my dad and my Uncle Jack, they both played, and they lived very close to Bangor Golf Club. I was kind of the pro shop kid growing up, learning to do the binding on golf clubs and putting on grips and inhaling too much solvent, and just a caddy around the club. And my father would go up to the club with our German Shepherd, and he would leave me and the German Shepherd outside, and under the auspices, or under the ruse, of playing golf, he would go to the men's bar, and I was outside, and I just started to practice.
Did you find that you had a facility for it, or was it just through practice? It was just sheer practice? No facility for it.
I turned pro at 17 years old with a 5 handicap, and I wasn't a particularly good 5 handicap either. And it was really the only alternative for me, it seemed, at the time. I hated school. I was labeled not particularly bright. As it turns out, I was a classic attention deficit kid. When I had my own children tested, I looked at the results and I thought, wow, it's like looking in the mirror. So if the subject absorbed me, I took it in. Like English and music were the only 2. And they're still the only 2 that I'm any good at, but it's always interested me.
But you did it. I mean, you did it well enough to make a living at it.
Oh well, golf I improved very quickly. But again, that focus, that hyper focus. If it is something that you want to do, if you're that kind of a kid, you will learn quickly. And, you know, my father gave me a kind of, I remember when I came home from school, the day that I decided to turn pro, I was in a geography class, and they were teaching the average rainfall in Western Samoa, which I thought would be very useful for whatever it was I was going to end up doing. And I just stood up and excused myself and went home and told my mom, and she said, you know, wait till your dad gets home and tell him. So, and he worked at the docks in Belfast, and he came home. And he says, your mother tells me that you want to play golf for a living. And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, does it give you goosebumps? And I was kind of taken aback. I didn't really expect that. And I imagined myself as Lee Trevino. He was my hero,
right,
growing up. And my friends, you know, they would play the part of, you know, Jack Nicklaus or you know, Tom Watson or whoever, but I was always Trevino, and it gave me a tremendous, just imagining myself being in that position. I said, yeah, it does. You know, it excites me. He said, well, then you'd better do it, or you might end up in a job that you don't like. And he collected some money. They didn't have any money, you know, from his friends, and just enough to get me across the water to England, where I spent 3 months in an assistant pros job in Hertfordshire, and I missed my mom. I was homesick. So came home and got a job at Royal Belfast and then Hollywood Golf Club, the club that Rory McIlroy grew up in. I was the assistant pro there 19 years before that little bugger was born. And in that time, you know, I got better at the game and got on the European tour, I think in '78 maybe.
I have to ask you about the drinking, because everything that I've read about you talks about the prodigious amount of alcohol that you used to consume. And when did it start? When did the drinking start for you? How old were you?
That's a good question. You know, I was drinking so much I don't remember. Not that early. You know, I mean, it wasn't like 14 or 15 or anything like that. I think it was probably around the time that I turned pro and left home and started to earn some money. I mean, that took a couple of years, but and I just got better and better at it. And unfortunately, I mean, I didn't quit because I was a bad drunk. I quit because I was spectacular. You know, I was a functional alcoholic. I am. And you know, a lot of people didn't know that I had a problem until I actually quit.
Right.
I was drinking 2.5 bottles of whiskey a day and taking 40 Vicodin.
How could you even? That's a lot. Yes, that is a lot.
Yeah.
How do you even function? I mean, that's astonishing that you could actually get through a day and put two words together.
Yeah, it was. But you know, I had to drink a bottle to get to where it seemed to me other people started in terms of feeling normal. My head was always tremendously busy, and I didn't know. I mean, I have bipolar disorder.
Right. Which has only been diagnosed in the last few years,
in the last probably 8 or 9 years. But it all began to make sense. You know, I was capable of overwhelming sadness. And I didn't have the manic highs that you often see, but tremendous periods of that hyper-focus. You know, and when something interests me, I've got to do it 110%. And when if it didn't go right, or if something dreadful happened to a friend, or like I mean, I vicariously lived those experiences and didn't really understand why until fairly recently.
Yeah. You mentioned taking Vicodin. So when did the pill taking start, and why?
Yeah, well, both the alcohol and the narcotics, they're painkillers, and you know I had an appalling experience with my first marriage, and I think that was probably the catalyst for it. You know, and there's two sides to every story when it comes to that. But it was horrifying for me, especially considering the mental illness aspect of it. You know, so I think it started midway, maybe through that, or maybe close to the beginning. And I also had bad elbows towards the end of my playing career. And I quit when I was 35. So I think in my late 20s, I started to get pain in the outside of my left elbow. And after a little while, the only way that I could play was by numbing it up. And we're drug testing in golf now. Not that a narcotic is a banned substance, but I can assure you that there isn't a drug that helps you play better golf. And if there is, I'm going to be so pissed off because I spent 20 years looking for it.
Well, it's interesting to me because if you, as you say, if you were taking these things in part to get you to where you thought most other people started, then were you basically functioning for all intents and purposes as a normal person with all of this stuff in your system?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it really didn't seem to start affecting me until, later on. And I also drank it relatively quickly. I didn't, start drinking at lunchtime or anything like that. Right. It was generally after I didn't play drunk. So it was all taking me to a point at which there's a great line in A Cat on a Hot Tin Roof with Paul Newman. His wife or his girlfriend, I can't remember which it is, asked him, why do you have to drink so much? And he said, I have to hear the click. And every alcoholic, every addict knows what that means. You have to get to a certain place before you stop. Wherever that place is, it's where it doesn't hurt anymore. And for me, it was when I was able to go to sleep. And only when I quit, I realized that I have a sleeping problem. I don't sleep more than 3 hours maybe a night. I take naps during the day. But
you mean like even today?
Oh, today, yeah, absolutely. When I was, and I didn't have it before because I was in a coma, basically drug and alcohol induced coma. And
but did you not wake up in the morning and feel like crap, like the rest of us do?
That's the functional part of it. I didn't. I didn't suffer from hangovers, which is why it was so easy to drink more. And the capacity to drink increased as the years went by.
Recently, while playing golf, actually, I asked a friend who quit drinking a long time ago. I said, when was the last time you had a drink? And he said, well, he named the day. It was November something. In fact, it'll be 40 years this coming November.
Wow.
And I said, that's astonishing. He said, yeah. And he said, and I never went to AA, so nobody's going to give me a big damn medal or anything.
Yeah.
Can you remember the day that you quit?
Yeah.
When was it?
It was in Prince Edward Island.
Really?
In the Maritimes, yeah. I was doing a made-for-TV match, the TV for Canadian TV, and it was Tom Watson and Jack Nicklaus. And I'd interviewed Jack in the clubhouse, and he was there with Barbara, and I'd got Tom in front of the camera, and I was at the very lowest point in my life. I think I'd had enough. All I could think about was, the pills and the bottle in my room, and I hated the fact that I relied on them, and I didn't realize at the time, so badly depressed and addicted that it was the only thing in my life that mattered. And Tom Watson was sitting across like this. The camera was right here, and I asked him the first question, and he put his hand over the lens, and he said, "You're not well, are you?" And I didn't know what to think. I said, "No, I'm not." "How do you know?" And he said, "I could see it in your eyes." And I said to him, "What do you see?" And he looked at me and said, "My reflection." And I was at the bottom of this dank, slimy, cold hole in the ground, and his was the one warm, dry hand when I, finally reached up that helped me out of it. He said, "You need to come with me." I said, "To where?" He said, "To Kansas." And now I'm trying to wriggle out of it. At this point, I said, "You need 2 kayaks and a float plane to get to Toronto from here. How are we going to get to Kansas?" At which point, Jack piped up behind, said, "Yeah, I've got a G5." And I've always been lucky.
So what did you do? Did you go into rehab or something? What did you?
No, I went and I stayed with Tom in Kansas City. After the match, Jack flew me down to West Palm and then on to Kansas City. And I stayed with Tom for a couple of days, and he found me a meeting in Dallas, not far from where I lived, and I got on a bicycle when I went home, and I rode to the meeting, and I went every day and got a better bicycle and took a longer route, and eventually one day I just rode to Oklahoma, went right by the meeting, and the bike became, my therapy.
Right.
But like everything else, I had to do it 110%.
Yeah.
So I was riding 300, 400, sometimes 500 miles a week, but not sleeping. So getting up at 2:30 in the morning and being done by 7 or 8. And it was like taking my arm and just sweeping the table clean for the day, of all the problems that might, I felt able to cope with it because of that. Until I got run over the first time.
I was going to say, yes, you did mention that you've been run over 3 times.
Yeah, and the irony was...
I shouldn't be laughing, I'm sorry.
No, it is quite funny.
3 times is...
Yeah, I eventually quit riding the bike because being in the ER started to look like a hobby. But I got very badly injured in the first one. And I remember flying through the air when the truck hit me from behind with a wing mirror, and he was towing a trailer full of garden equipment, and being knocked forwards and thinking, I hope this isn't a beer truck, because the irony would be too much for me. I landed on my left shoulder, blew it apart, bounced into the road, and it ran over me with both axles. And I can't close my left hand properly. I lost the ulnar nerve here. This arm was crushed, the ribs broken down the left side, a punctured lung. And this is on the 14th of March, 2007, the day that Elliot Spitzer got caught with a $5,000 an hour hooker, because when they wheeled me into my hospital room, I was paralyzed with because of my tolerance to narcotics. They didn't realize that I wasn't anesthetized, but they did a thoracostomy, punched a hole in my chest with what looked like a screwdriver and a wooden mallet, and put a wound vacuum on my arm, drained the arm, and I was conscious throughout the whole thing, but unable to speak, or my eyes were wide open. But paralyzed. I couldn't even move my eyeballs. But when they straightened me up in the bed, the TV was tuned to CNN, and Elliot Spitzer was up there with a $5,000 an hour hooker, and I remember thinking, there is no God. Because that's funny, and I can't laugh.
Yes.
With tubes coming out of me, and yeah. And I got back on the bike several months later. And the second time I got on it, we were in Dearborn to cover the PGA Championship in Detroit at Oakland Hills. And I woke up in a hospital wearing a turban, where I'd been hit from behind again. And this was only the second time on the bicycle. And I've still, to this day, I have no recollection of that, none whatsoever. There was a cop in the room, and he said he'd take I had no idea what he was talking about.
And how bad were your injuries that time?
Well, I got a pretty bad concussion. And again, down the left side, cut and bruised and that sort of thing, didn't help. And a couple of years after that, I went through a windshield in New York, and that was enough. After that, I lost my nerve and really thought, I've got to find something else to do here. What's saving my life is going to end it.
So what, did you find something else? What did you replace it with? Because one assumes that you would have to replace it with something.
Yes.
That's the nature of you.
Yeah, I make bolt-action rifles.
That'll do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you stumbled across that particular hobby how?
In 2007, I went to Baghdad for morale, welfare, and recreation. I had grown up in that urban warfare environment, even though we were on the periphery, and it wasn't particularly violent or in the area that I lived. I mean, I knew what coalition forces were going through from my own experience as a child, and I couldn't believe the way that it was being covered by the major networks and by newspapers. It seemed tremendously negative, and I wanted to go and see for myself, and I was blown away. I couldn't believe how amazing these kids were. The professionalism, the compassion that they had for the Iraqi people, the restraint that they showed on a daily basis that was never reported. And I sort of fell in love with the armed forces, and when I came home, it had become very important to me to be an American citizen at that point. And I didn't want to be an Irish American, and I didn't want to be, I didn't want somebody else to be an Italian American or an African American. I really feel that in this country that we need to develop a keener sense of national identity and like lose where we used to be from, or where our parents or grandparents used to be from, and just be Americans. And that motivated me to start, the foundation and try to influence whoever I could with that particular philosophy. I would get more and more snipers that would come in. My partner in the foundation lives in Maryland, and his brother-in-law was the admitting sergeant major at Walter Reed, so we had access to the more severely mentally ill, PTSD. I always tell these kids that I have PTSD. I've got pre-traumatic stress disorder. I'm pretty sure something bad's going to happen, but I don't know when. But that's how I got into the long-distance shooting and actually making the rifles. I started a little custom rifle making company for a wounded Green Beret called 5 Toes Custom Gunworks, because he only had 5 toes. He lost his leg in Iraq, and that's how I got interested in it.
Tell me what it was like when the bipolar diagnosis came. After all those years, did in retrospect, did everything suddenly start making sense?
Yes.
Did all your behavior start making sense to you?
Well, not all of my behavior,
well,
but it explained a lot to me how I... the love and sadness thing, and I'm sure there are people that can identify with this. Have you ever loved something so much that you're terrified of losing it? It's sort of a knife edge that you walk like that, and it's very similar, I think, with comics, with comedians, that walk that line as well. It's very close to tragedy, humor. So it made me more aware of that line, and if I happened to fall, which side I needed to fall on. I take 14 pills a day now to be this normal. That was a huge part of it as well, was finding the right medicine, because there's a chemical imbalance there that needs to be repaired. And
do you find yourself going into the trap, as often happens with people who have to take drugs to balance out their chemistry or whatever, that you start feeling so normal on that medication, you think, well, I'm normal, I can not take it today. It
comes back in a different disguise.
Yeah.
That's why people don't take their medicine. It's difficult to take. A lot of them, they make you feel hollow, and
yes,
you're never going to be the same. And it's very difficult to come to terms with the fact that you're always going to be what some people consider to be ill. I at this point in my life, refuse to suffer from a mental illness. I live with it. And I think if you're positive enough, and if you're lucky enough to find the right mix of medicine, that you can find an advantage in it. It's like autistic kids, or they're brilliant at something. And I think it's our job to find out what that something is. It can be very difficult. But if you do live with this kind of a mental illness, there is an upside to it, and if you can find the right mix of medicine, perhaps you can find out what that is.
The fact that you've gone into broadcasting or doing all of this sort of stuff, and just prior to this interview, we watched you shoot a couple of hours of promos, and that's exhausting work. I know. I've done some of that myself, but not as much as I saw you do here today. But is this the sort of thing that, I guess, for you, given the drive that you have and the number of hours in your day, which exceeds the number of hours that the rest of us have in our days, that this is a walk in the spring rain for you most of the time?
Sometimes it is, and that's back in the bipolar range again. Some of the time it's great, and sometimes it's really hard work.
Yeah.
But I have to be busy. The addict's worst enemy is spare time.
Yeah.
And what do you do with that time that you used to spend taking drugs or drinking? You've got to find something to fill it. And I'm awake for so many hours of the day that that's the challenge for me, is to get that balance between how much work do you want to do, because you have to do it, but it'll also make you sick, if you do too much of it. So I'm, again, trying to stay on the line there and not go off on either side of it.
You rely pretty heavily on your wife too, do you not?
Oh, wow. I wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
Without a shadow of a doubt. She's the most extraordinary person. I don't know where I bank. No idea. I'm involved. Well, I'm in charge of every major purchase in our household under $5. She catches me when I fall. She's when she met me, I was in the middle of a horrific divorce. I was homeless, jobless, penniless, drunken drug addict. And she looked at me and said, "Yeah, I can fix that." And she hasn't as yet, but
she's still working on it.
No one could have stayed with it and put in an effort like she does. I love her so much.
You go out on the road. In fact, not too much longer after the day that we're sitting here shooting this interview, you're actually going to be in my hometown in Ottawa, Canada,
yes,
doing a thing,
yeah,
strangely enough. What made you decide that you wanted to do that sort of thing? You wanted to go out on the road and just, as essentially, from my understanding, not having seen you do it, but essentially as a raconteur, really?
Yeah. It's finding an intellectual challenge, if you like, and I love my job. I love the fact that I can be with the best players in the world, and I don't feel like a broadcaster. I don't feel like a commentator. I feel, and people refer to me as an ex-professional golfer. I'm always going to be a professional golfer. I just don't play anymore. You have to apply for your amateur status back. I never did that. So, I mean, I've been a pro for 40 years, and I still feel like one, except I never miss the cut. I'm always in the lead. And, you know, the game has been tremendous to me. Even though I don't play at all anymore, I can't. I'm not sure that I would want to.
Well, I read a quote from you saying that you couldn't believe you played it for 22 years, that you thought it was a silly game.
Yeah.
Were you just mouthing off, or do you really believe that?
No. I mean, I don't think it is a game. I think it's a pastime, for sure. But if you look at most of the people who play golf, 90% of the time they look like they're not enjoying themselves at all. It's torture.
It is. I didn't start playing until I was 50, and I stink.
Well, but it hooks you, you know, like a drug, because everybody. And the great thing about golf is that golf fans, people that watch it on television, are actually still actively involved in playing the game. Perhaps, you know, even later in life they've just taken it up. Fans of other sports, maybe they used to play it, but they don't anymore. You know, so
that's a good distinction, actually.
Yeah. Golf fans are still suffering. They're still suffering, and it doesn't matter what level you get to, whether you're Tiger Woods or a 24 handicap, you can have the same feeling, you know, in golf. Not everybody can throw a 60-yard touchdown pass or, you know, as a 100-mile-an-hour slap shot, but everyone can make it from 60 feet and catch one out of the center of the club face, and just have that.
When that happens,
it's like this.
That's right.
It's got you.
Absolutely. We've run short of time, and I really appreciate you doing this because, as I said, you just did a couple of hours of yeoman work.
I have nothing but time.
Thanks for doing this, Dave. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.